Welcome for the fifth time to zooming into one of the Jewish holidays. We started last Shavuot, and now I'm happy to say that this is the fifth time, and we're going to share some Jewish law about Purim, Bible analysis of the Purim story from Megillat Esther, Midrash, and Jewish art related to Purim. So I'm going to begin. I hope you'll be able to hear this. I tried doing this in a more sophisticated fashion, but some of you may know there's a video that's very popular on the internet, on YouTube, of Elon Gold saying why he's happy that Jews don't have Christmas trees. The video is about 5 minutes long. I'm just going to play a short piece because it's a nice lead-in to our learned discussion tonight about getting drunk on Purim. Let's see if this works.
So happy that Christmas trees aren't part of our traditions and our holidays. If it were, there would be 1,000 rules and regulations regarding the tree. There would be a tractate of Talmud, Masechet Ha'etz, and it would just be chapters and chapters of rabbis arguing about how you shecht the tree, where to shecht it, when to shecht it, if it has a blemish, can you even shecht it at all? What kind of tree must it be? Well, it cannot bear fruit because that would be destroying future food, but it must emit sap. You have to see a droplet of sap, a kazayit of sap, because to show it's a living tree, you can't cut down a tree that's already dead. You got to kill it yourself in the most humane way possible. Can a goy cut down the tree for you? Is it mavushal, non-mavushal? Big machloket, big disagreement. When you're bringing the tree, thank you, there's more. When you're bringing the tree into the house, do you make the bracha before you enter the doorway? Hillel says once your left foot is inside the foyer, it's too late. Shammai says no, as long as both feet are in the house. And they both agree it may be too late to make the bracha on entering, but it's never too late to make the bracha on mounting. When you mount the tree and when you stand.
It goes on for 5 minutes. Clearly, Elon Gold had a good day school education. He manages in this analysis of the laws of the Christmas tree to bring in both the laws of Hanukkah and the laws of the Lulav and Etrog. But I think it's a good segue into our piece this evening, where we're going to talk about the laws of getting drunk on Purim. Needless to say, the most important mitzvot connected to Purim are reading the Megillah, which is certainly the first half of the tractate of Megillah is devoted to that subject. When you read the Megillah, what time of day, what dates, sitting, standing, etc., etc. And on Megillah folio 7a, you have a discussion of Mishloach Manot, of sending food to your friends, Matanot le'evyonim, of alms to the poor. And we can understand all of those mitzvot. They're directly related to the Purim story. What we can't understand is why in the world we should get drunk on Purim. If you read the Megillah backwards and forwards, as I do every year, various chapters, there have been years when I read the entire Megillah, there is no mention of getting drunk on Purim in Megillat Esther itself. And the reason that this halacha or minhag is so bizarre is because Judaism in general has a very negative view of getting drunk. We all know the story of Noah in Genesis chapter 9, when they come out of the Teva, when they come out of the ark, and Noah plants a vineyard, he gets drunk, and what happens with his sons. We know the story of Lot, who after running away from Sodom and Amorah, his daughters get him drunk and they sleep with him. And in addition, in rabbinic literature, you have many statements against getting drunk. One of the explanations for the sin of Nadav and Avihu, the sons of Aaron, why were they killed? Because they served in the temple and the tabernacle when they were drunk. Drunkenness leads to forbidden sexual relations, as it says in the Tractate of Ktubot. An example in the Tractate of Sanhedrin, Ein davar shemevi yalala adam el hayayin. There is nothing that causes a person greater lamentation than wine. So with these sources in mind, it's very hard to understand the source that I'm about to show you. I will share screen if I can find it. Can you all see the word text in front of you? Just how drunk should a Jew get on Purim? Okay, yafet. So this is the famous passage in Megillah, folio 7b. Amar Rava, Michaya vinish levasome befuria ad delo yada ben aror Haman lebaruch Mordechai. Rava said he's a fourth generation Amorah in Babylon, which means he lived around the year 300, 320 of the Common Era. A person is required to imbibe, to get drunk on Purim, until he cannot tell the difference between Arur Haman, cursed be Haman, and Baruch Mordechai, blessed be Mordechai. And after Rava's statement, there is a story. Rabbah and Rabbi Zera made a Purim feast together. They became intoxicated. Rabbah stood up and killed Rabbi Zera. On the morrow, Rabbah prayed and revived him. The following year, Rabbah said to him, "Let Master come and we will make the Purim feast together." Rabbi Zera replied, "Lo b'chol shata b'shata mitrachesh nisa." Miracles don't happen every hour. In other words, I ran out of luck last year. I don't want to get killed again. Now, the question is, what do we make of this requirement of getting drunk on Purim? And what do we make of the story that follows the requirement? So as I gather here in my responsa various explanations of the story and the requirement before we get to the halachic sources, there's a famous book I have on my shelf behind my head here, the Abu Draham. Rabbi David Abu Draham lived in Sevilla in Spain, wrote the book around the year 1340. And Rabbi David Abu Draham says that the sages require drinking on Purim, since all of the miracles in the days of Achashverosh occurred at drinking parties. In other words, if you go through the Megillah, many of the key events happened at Mishteh, at a party involving drinking. So Rabbi David Abu Draham says we drink on Purim in order to remember the miracles of Purim, which all had some sort of connection with the Mishteh, with a party of drinking wine. My own explanation is much simpler. Rava may have required drinking on Purim because Rava was a vintner. We have this image of the rabbis of the Talmud sitting in the yeshiva teaching their students. They did that in their spare time. Most of them worked for a living. And Rava's occupation was that he was a vintner. We know from a story in Brachot that he traded in wine. And we know from a story in Psachim that he used to drink wine even on Erev Pesach, when normally people do not drink wine in order to save room in their brains for 4 cups of wine at night. It says that Rava would drink wine all day long on Erev Pesach in order to get in the mood for drinking wine at the Seder. So it could be that this was Rava's personal mishigas or personal preference of drinking wine on Purim, and perhaps he did not intend for all the Jewish people to follow his advice. Other explanations have been given throughout the ages. Most of them are apologetics. For example, Rabbi Ephraim, the son of Maimonides, says that Rabbah only injured Rabbi Zera, but did not actually kill him. The Marsha in Poland in the early 17th century says that Rabbi Zera became very ill due to the fact that Rabbah forced him to drink too much wine. In other words, he got sick, but he didn't actually die. The Meiri, whose name got left out in the next sentence, the Meiri, who died in Provence in the early 14th century, he says that the Aramaic word shachte should really be sachte with a samach. Sachte means he didn't slaughter him, but rather he squeezed him. He sat on him, and therefore he didn't actually kill his best friend. And that's the Meiri's way of getting around the story. Another rabbi, Rabbi Azariah of Figo in Venice around the year 1600, says that Rabbah confused Rabbi Zera so that he couldn't tell the difference between Arur Haman and Baruch Mordechai. And finally, Dr. Aaron Arend from Bar-Ilan University, who devoted an entire article to this subject, he says that Rabbah struck Rabbi Zera but did not actually kill him, or that Rabbi Zera fainted because he drank too much wine. And of course, these are all apologetic stories to try and explain how one rabbi could kill the other. And finally, Rabbi H.Z. Reines, in an article published in Hador in 1977, suggests that the entire story is a Purim Torah, a Purim joke. and that it didn't actually happen. Be that as it may, these are what philosophers and rabbis say about this story. Be that as it may, most rabbis related to this requirement of Rabbah and to the story in the Talmud in the same way that Elon Gold described about the Christmas tree. In other words, you have a statement in the Talmud that says that you're required to do X, followed by a story in which one rabbi or two rabbis actually did X. And the rabbis who are writing halakha have to decide whether this is halakha or is it not. So many rabbis took the easy road, and they simply quoted Rabbah or paraphrased what he said. And I listed here 8 famous poskim, famous halachic authorities in that category. You have the Rif, Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi, in Northern Africa in the 11th century. You have the Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher, in Toledo, died in 1327. And of course, you have the Shulchan Aruch, Rabbi Yosef Karo, writing in Safed in Tzfat in the middle of the 16th century. And as these rabbis took the easy route, they quote what Rava said in the Talmud: you have to get drunk on Purim until you can't distinguish between Arur Haman and Baruch Mordechai. However, I certainly haven't checked all the poskim on the subject, but my general impression is that the overwhelming majority of poskim, of rabbis, halachic authorities, did not feel comfortable with this requirement or with this story. To what mashal lamad davar domeh, to what can this be compared? Let's say the Jews, it's according to the 10 Commandments, it says lo tignov, you're not allowed to steal. And a rabbi would come along and say, well, you're not allowed to steal, but one day a year you are allowed to steal. That day is called Purim. Or let's say all year long Jews are not allowed to eat meat and milk together, lo tevashel gedi b'chalev imo. But one day a year, a rabbi says, on this day we waive that requirement and you can eat whatever you want. Obviously, drinking is not in that category. It's not in the 10 Commandments. But as we saw at the beginning, there was an aversion in the Jewish tradition to drinking. And you had all these rabbis who felt a dissonance, perhaps a cognitive dissonance, between what Rava says we're supposed to do and what these rabbis know that Judaism tells us to do, which is not to get drunk. So therefore, all of the rabbis we're going to meet now made a concerted effort to water down the requirement, no pun intended, to water down the requirement of getting drunk on Purim. So let's see what they did. So we start out with the Geonim. The Geonim are the rabbis who lived in Babylon between the years 500 and 1000 of the Common Era. And if you open up the major codes of Jewish law from the Gaonic period, Halachot Gedolot, written around the year 825, Halachot Ksuvot, they ignored this passage. In other words, they totally skipped over Rabbah, the story about Rabbah and Rabbi Zera. They totally ignored the passage we read at the beginning of this tshuva. They don't quote it at all. In other words, they felt uncomfortable with this requirement of getting drunk on Purim. They decided to ignore what Rabbah said and not quote it at all in their codes of Jewish law. The other explanations are more interesting, perhaps. We now meet a rabbi who's not well known. His name is Rabbi Ephraim. His book is on the shelf behind me, but in the inside row, I would have to take time to pull it out. Rabbi Ephraim of Kalach Hamad was a disciple of the Rif. He lived in North Africa in the 11th and 12th centuries. Rabbi Ephraim says that since the Talmud then quotes the story that Rabbah stood and killed Rabbi Zera, the statement of Rabbah, he has a different reading, Rabbah instead of Rabbah, the statement is set aside and one should not get drunk on Purim. Now, this is a very interesting approach. He says, Rabbah says, get drunk on Purim. Immediately they bring a story which shows you what happens when you get drunk on Purim. A rabbi kills his best friend. The purpose of the story was to cancel out the requirement. Using a Talmudic expression, Ma'aseh Rav, we learn from the story that we should not do what Rabbah recommended in the first sentence. So Rabbi Ephraim says that the story comes to cancel out the requirement, and we learn from the story that we should not get drunk on Purim. And in footnote number 4 here, I quote a lot of later rabbis who quote Rabbi Ephraim, and they seem to agree with him. In other words, a lot of rabbis quote Rabbi Ephraim as saying that the story cancels out the requirement, and therefore, despite what Rava said, we are not required to get drunk on Purim. The next set of explanations focus on the words of Rava. Remember, what did Rava say? Chayav adam levasome beforya ad delo yada ben arur Haman levaruch Mordechai. A person is required to get drunk on Purim until he doesn't know the difference between Arur Haman and Baruch Mordechai, between cursed be Haman and blessed be Mordechai. And what these rabbis say, and beginning with Rabbi Asher of Lunel, who lived in southern France in the beginning of the 13th century, he says that there was a complicated piyut, or liturgical poem, where one verse had the refrain Arur Haman, cursed be Haman. The next verse had the refrain Baruch Mordechai, blessed be Mordechai. And quote, to recite this piyut requires a clear mind because sometimes a person is not mindful and makes a mistake. And Rabbi Yitzchak wrote a piyut like this. In other words, this is not simply two expressions, cursed be Haman and blessed be Mordechai. This is a complicated poem with refrains that alternate between the verses. It requires a lot less wine to reach a state of intoxication where you can no longer recite the poem properly, and therefore Rabbi Asher ben Shaul is trying to reduce the drinking on Purim by saying that the intent here was not merely Arur Haman and Baruch Mordechai, but rather a complicated poem with alternating refrains. And number two is similar, but even more complicated. And this brings us back to that skit by Elon Gold. Others say that the sentence in question was longer and more complicated, like the one found in the Sefer Yerushalmi. And the sentence at the end of the poem, at the end of each verse was, Arura zeresh brucha Esther, arurim kol harashaim bruchim kol hayudim. Cursed be Zeresh, blessed be Esther, cursed be all the evil people, blessed be all the Jews. In other words, if you have to say this mouthful, this tongue twister, at the end of every verse, after just a small amount of wine, you will reach a state where you can no longer recite this poem. If that wasn't interesting enough, we have another way of reducing drunkenness on Purim, and this is an explanation which is stated by Rabbi Alexander Zuslin HaKohen, who unfortunately who died al Kiddush Hashem. He was killed, as a matter of fact, in connection with the Black Plague. And in his halachic work, Sefer Agudah, he said that, I'll read you the Hebrew, Yesh mefarshim lecheshbon, ki cheshbon ze kazeh. Some say that this has to do with the arithmetic because the sum of one is equal to the sum of the other. Well, believe it or not, in Gematria, Arur Haman and Baruch Mordechai both add up to the number 502. It takes a Jew to figure this out, okay? So in other words, you have to drink enough wine that you can no longer figure out the Gematria of Arur Haman 502 equals Baruch Mordechai 502, which is, of course, a lot smaller amount of wine, a much smaller amount of wine. And therefore, you will reduce the amount of wine you need to imbibe on Purim because they're talking about this gematria, which drunk people will have trouble doing. And as you can see here, this explanation of Sefer Agudah was quoted by many other rabbis as well. And the most inventive one in this camp is Rabbi Yosef Chaviva, Nimukei Yosef, who lived in Spain in the 15th century. And this is a quote, "One should not go crazy in his drunkenness and be drawn after laughter, levity, and profanity. And the early prophets only enacted a day of feasting and joy." That's a quote from Yom Mishteh V'Simcha from Megillat Esther. "Rather, one should say funny things so that the beholders will think that one cannot distinguish between cursed be Haman and blessed be Mordechai." In other words, you don't actually have to be drunk. You just have to act as if you are drunk. Or if you're an Israeli, to quote Hagasha Shachiver, ki ilu ata shikor. You have to pretend you're drunk on Purim, but you don't actually have to be drunk on Purim. So once again, we see here an attempt to reduce the amount of drinking. Another camp of rabbis of poskim is the camp of Maimonides. And as you know, Maimonides was a rationalist. Chances are he didn't like the idea of Jews getting drunk on Purim. And this is what Maimonides writes in his Code of Jewish Law, the Mishneh Torah, Hilchot Megillah. How is the requirement of the Purim Seudah? What is the requirement? That he should eat meat and prepare a nice feast according to what he can afford, and he drinks wine until he gets drunk and falls asleep. In other words, you only need to drink enough wine to fall asleep. If you fall asleep, you can no longer tell the difference between Arur Haman and Baruch Mordechai, right? If you're asleep, you obviously can't tell the difference between these two explanations. And therefore, Rambam says you don't have to get raging drunk. You have to drink enough wine to fall asleep, and then you will no longer be able to tell the difference between these two terms. A similar approach was taken by the Ramah, Rabbi Moshe Isserlis, in the Shulchan Aruch, and also in his commentary on the Torah, quote, that he should drink more than is his custom, and he should sleep, and since he is asleep, he does not know the difference between cursed be Haman and blessed be Mordechai. So that's the second camp. Rather than focusing on the words Arur Haman and Baruch Mordechai, focusing on what you're doing, you drink more than you used to, you fall asleep, and then you no longer know the difference between those terms. A very interesting approach of getting around the drunkenness is an emphasis on another word in Rava's sentence, and the word is ad, right? Ad de lo yada, until you don't know the difference. Well, any of you who have studied Talmud know that frequently in the Talmud, when the word ad appears, the Talmud says ad vichlal or ad velo ad bichlal. Is it up to and including, or up to and not including? So these rabbis say that the ad here means up to and not including a state where you cannot tell the difference between Arur Haman and Baruch Mordechai. In other words, you drink wine, but you don't drink wine up to the point where you can't tell the difference. Ad velo ad bichlal, up to and not including that state of inebriation. And we see it here in the words of Rabbi Meir ben Shimon HaMe'ili, who lived in Provence in the early 1200s, ad up to but not including. And similarly, Rabbi Nathanael Weil, Germany, 18th century, ad up to and not including, because otherwise he would reach the drunkenness of Lot. In other words, here he's referring to one of the biblical stories that I mentioned at the beginning of our shiur. We know that Lot is not considered a positive figure, certainly not as getting drunk and sleeping with his daughters, and therefore it must be ad velo ad bichlal, up to and not including. And finally, the last set of explanations grabs the bull by the horns and deals with the word chayav. What does it mean? What does Rava mean when he says chayav adam levasome, that a person is required to get drunk? Rabbi Eliezer ben Yoel Halevi, the Raviyah, Germany, 13th century, says mitzvah be'alma velo li'ikuv. This is a general mitzvah, as in the colloquial expression, do a mitzvah. In other words, this is not really a legal requirement. It's a mitzvah b'alma. It's a good idea. Velo li'ikuv, it is not something absolutely necessary. So this is the Raviyah's way of getting around the word chayav, you're required to get drunk. Rabbi Shimon HaMe'ili, whom we mentioned before, adds another interpretation. Not exactly, rather an exaggeration, but drunkenness is a serious prohibition, and there is no sin greater than it, for it itself is the cause of forbidden sexual relations and bloodshed, and a number of prohibitions and evil of idol worship. And this is not the joy written in the Bible, but this is called laughter and derision and levity. In other words, he grabs the bull by the horns. He says the Hebrew is lashon havai. This is an exaggeration. We should not take it literally, and nobody should really get that drunk. And the one I think is the bravest is Rabbi Menachem HaMe'iri, the famous Me'iri, whose Talmud commentaries were finally published for manuscript in the 20th century. And Me'iri basically says, I disagree with Rava. In any case, we are not commanded to get drunk and to degrade ourselves out of joy. For we were not commanded about joy of debauchery and foolishness, but about joy of delight, that we should reach from it the love of God, blessed be he, and gratitude for the miracles which he performed for us. And finally, the most original explanation is that of Rabbi Aaron of Lunel, 14th century, early 14th century Provence. He says that he should drink more than his normal custom in order to rejoice greatly and make the poor rejoice, and he shall comfort them, and that is true joy. I think that this last explanation is brilliant. He's tying in the idea of getting drunk on Purim to the mitzvah of matanot le'evyonim, that we have to give alms to the poor on Purim. He says, why should we have a good frame of mind on Purim? If we drink a little wine, we'll be in a good frame of mind and we'll give more money to the poor. So he's trying to tie in this idea of Rava, of getting drunk, to a much more positive mitzvah of helping the poor on Purim. But I think the bottom line is that all of these many rabbis who lived in so many different centuries, in so many different countries, felt a dissonance between what Rava said and what the Jewish tradition teaches us. They knew that Jews don't get drunk. They knew that getting drunk is not a positive value in Judaism, and they did not say that one day a year we will ignore the Jewish tradition on this subject. And therefore, in a very creative way, as in a Lone Gold sketch, in a very creative way, they managed to get around Rava's requirement, either by interpreting it to death, or like the Meiri, by saying it is not a requirement, or like Rabbi Aaron of Lunel, who said the only purpose of drinking wine on Purim is to make sure that we give more matanot le'evyonim, more alms to the poor. My own approach is that of Maimonides and Rabbi Moshe Isserles, which is not surprising for those of you who know me, which is you fall asleep, you're asleep, you can't tell the difference between Arur Haman and Baruch Mordechai, and I can easily fall asleep without drinking any wine at all. So that in a nutshell is 15 or 1700 years of commentary on Rava's statement in the tractate of Megillah. Unfortunately, I don't think I left any time for questions unless somebody wants to get in a very brief comment. Any of you have a comment or a question about the requirement of getting drunk on Purim?
I have a quick question.
Very, very interesting.
Who's talking?
Steve.
Yes, Moisey.
Yeah, I was just questioning the timing of drinking, because the mishteh is supposed to happen at the end of the day. Therefore, there is no interference with the timing of the reading of the Megillah.
Right.
So why is it an issue?
Why is it an issue whether you should get drunk or not? Well, it's not an issue.
I mean, if the timing is during the mishteh, and added to that, they say mishteh, which is lishtot, as opposed to seudah.
Right. But in classic halachic terminology, it's not called a mishteh, it's called seudat Purim. It's called a seudah, a mitzvah feast. You're right. From a halachic point of view, it doesn't bother you reading the Megillah, which happened in the morning. It doesn't bother you giving out mishloach manot or matanot le'evyonim. But the problem here was not a halachic problem. It was a philosophical problem. How can we tell Jews to get drunk when everything in our tradition tells us the opposite? So I think I will stop here because I don't want to take any more time from Dr. Schwartz. So it's my pleasure. And by the way, if you want to read this tshuva, it's on the Schechter website. Just write in Google, David Golinkin, drunk Purim, and you will find it. It is my pleasure.